Hello, my name is Lesley Atherton and this is my short story called Reflect Upon the Tree. Max's feet had always seemed too large and long for his body, as if he'd been designed for stability in the shape of a capital L. Even though he was a big man, his feet were even bigger. In fact, they and his height were the first things that attracted me to him. After them, it was his face. I'd always liked it. His skin was a little darker than mine, but he'd never seen the inside of a tanning parlour. It was just the way he was made. And his bone structure, I liked that too, very much. Think of Jimmy Nail and Billy Bragg, Benedict Cumberbatch, Lawrence Fox and Shane MacGowan, and you've almost got his look. Craggy, wonky, and definitely not without appeal. His boxer's bent nose suited him and led my obsession. At first it did, anyway. At first, before I knew better and realised that betrayal suited Max too. And before I realised that what suited me at that stage of our so-called relationship was revenge. That night, Max led me to the forest. It wasn't unusual, just part of our courtship ritual. I followed him willingly, but not for the reasons I usually would follow. Assuming he was about to get lucky, Max turned to wink, and cringing inside I smiled back. My deception must have convinced him as he swung forward again and continued to walk. After a few hundred yards, just as we reached our usual place, our woodland bed, he dropped my hand and stopped dead still. I said, "Max, come on." But he spoke back. "Reflect upon the frowning tree, impish elves prance from bough to bough." Almost poetry, I thought, and I smirked. It was typical of him to talk fantasy gobbledygook pre-bed as part of his seduction charm offensive. Some days he'd present me with a newly picked bloom fresh from the forest floor and compare my walk to the flight of an orphaned dragon he caroused with the previous moonlit night. But that wasn't what I wanted today. Max the poet did not figure in my plan. Max the lover had to get horizontal. My plan was a simple one. I would go to him, remove his clothes item by item, and push him down naked and expectant onto the usual moss mattress, where our relationship was frequently blessed with union. I would not allow him to touch me, but instead would undo my top few buttons one by one in the beginnings of a striptease that I knew he would enjoy. It would focus his mind on my body and what he believed was our intention. I would entice him slowly, but deliberately, till he was weak to resist, then would bind and blindfold him, as was his usual request, before departing and tossing his clothes into the stream, I being vengeful with hatred for misdemeanours as yet unconfessed. That was the intention, to punish him for the disloyalty and perfidy. But just as Max was frozen, suddenly I also couldn't walk. In horror I looked again at Max, whose cute, ugly face, the face I'd once loved and still did, despite my righteous malevolent anger, was frozen, apart from expressionless lips chanting, "Reflect upon the frowning tree, impish elves prance from bough to bough." What the hell was he talking about? His body frozen, eyes staring, lips chanting. It was eerie seeing those wandering eyes who'd found another woman to make love to, those eyes which had not been fixed on me in a long time, being once again fixed on another place. That place was ahead of us. I couldn't see it myself as his body blocked it, so instead of continuing my vengeance, I used the little movement I still possessed to turn my head and follow his gaze while still he incanted, "Reflect upon, reflect upon, reflect upon." And as my head turned, I realised there really were elves prancing from bough to bough, though to me I'd have to say their movements were less of a prance and more of a march or a stolid dance, a dance of aggression and deliverance, and something else too. Certainly they were elves with a purpose. Something in their actions calmed me, but Max was reacting to something that wasn't quite right. His face paled in the twilight, and I knew without reaching out to touch him that he'd be cold, though the evening was warm and humid. I knew without holding his body that he shivered with fear, and I knew without hearing, for my ears had now ceased to hear, that he was still incanting reflect upon, reflect upon, reflect upon, as the elves bounded from their frowning tree towards the still and stiff figure of my soon-to-be ex-lover, all 6'8" of him. Their glee was apparent as they bounced past me with trill and mischievous giggles, and pounced on him with delight, knocking him to the forest floor and taking over my usual job by removing his clothes. But they took things a little further than I had intended. They began smearing his face and torso with honey extracted from leather pots they carried on their backs. The largest of the 4 elves shouted, "Bear food, bear food," and the others quickly joined in to complete their anointing of Max. And he, my massive, once-loved, duplicitous man, lay motionless, dazed and covered in golden stickiness. I couldn't help but wonder how many hives of bees had produced such a quantity of honey, how the elves had harvested it, and why the elves were shouting, "Bear food, bear food." But of course I soon understood, and was powerless to do much else but watch, as the elves bounded back to their trees with eager, fascinated expressions. The hungry grizzly bear sauntered towards my supine ex-sweetheart, scraped inquiringly at his chest, and began to lick and bite with increasing interest, for underneath the sweetness of the honey was the tang of terror, and that was clearly irresistible. As I watched my erstwhile lover devoured, simultaneously both entree and dessert, the smallest elf jumped from its branch onto my shoulder. "Revenge is sweet," the elf said. "Sweet like honey," I replied.